couple words on whiskey. What's whiskey, you ask? Well, whiskey is a distilled spirit that's made of fermented grain. Usually that's barley, corn, rye, or wheat, any mixture thereof. Those are the most popular. Whiskeys are generally aged in wood, which is what gives it its color, hopefully. And usually it's white oak. It's made all over the world. There are many types and classes, but the unifying characteristics are those: that it's a distilled spirit made of grain and that it's been aged in oak. But what grains you use, how you distill it, what oak you use, what treatment the oak gets, all of that is what gives it all of its complexity and all of its nuance. So it's made all over the world, famously in Scotland, in Ireland, Japan, India, Canada, America, especially with bourbons and rye whiskeys. So whiskey can be made all over the world, and the interesting thing about whiskey is the differences. The similarities are pretty straightforward, but it's interesting that how popular it is to make now around the world in emerging markets, not just the ones I've just mentioned, but giving distillers specifically a box to paint in, how creative they can be with using that kind of limited scope. Whiskey. Scotch, finally. Scotch whiskey, the most famous of all the whiskeys. Simply put, what is Scotch? Scotch is whiskey made in Scotland. There are 5 types of Scotch whiskey. We carry 3 of them. The 3 we carry are single malt whiskey, which is the one that probably gets the most fame. There's blended malt whiskey. There's blended whiskey. There's single grain whiskey, and there's blended grain whiskey. What does all this mean? We'll start with the grains, or we'll start with a thumbnail. Single malt whiskey means whiskey that's made with 100% barley malt. What is barley malt? Barley malt is barley, which is a grain, and we know whiskeys are made from grain. Barley malt is malted barley, and by malted I mean germinated. So they take the grain, the dried seed, they introduce water, they let it germinate. So basically they trick the seed into thinking it's about to grow, and it starts converting its own starches to sugars. And that's important because we make alcohol from sugar, not starch. So you do that to the grain, and then you dry it out to halt the process and keep it stable. And then you can ferment that grain when you're ready. And then after you've fermented that, you have a low alcohol solution, and you can distill that, in the case of Scotch, twice. So all of Scotch whiskey is at least twice distilled. And that's how you get your high proof spirit, and that's how Scotch whiskey is made. So single malt is all from germinated barley malt. Blended malt is a blend of different single malts. You're like, well, I don't understand. You didn't explain. How could you blend different single malts? Well, here's the thing. Single malt is defined as all malt made from the same distillery, whereas a blended malt is a blend of different single grain malt whiskeys. So if this says Speyside blended malt whiskey, which means they went to 3 different distilleries and had 3 different Speyside single malts and blended those 3 different single malts to make this one blended. This used to be called a vatted malt. Now it's just called a blended malt whiskey. I think they thought that was going to be clearer somehow. So that's the second category: single malt, blended whiskey, which is blended Scotch whiskey, which is probably easily the best selling of the categories. It's Johnny Walker, Chivas, Dewar's, Hagen Hagen's Dimple Pinch, all of the Scotch brands that were really popular before the mid 80s. Those are all blended Scotch whiskeys, and that just means they're allowed to use more than just germinated barley malt. It's not malt whiskey, it's whiskey. So they're allowed to use other grains. So they will use barley. Barley in some malt whiskey, in fact, but they'll also use rye, wheat, corn to make a blended whiskey. Now, a single grain whiskey is a whiskey made from a single grain, but not germinated barley malt. So they might use wheat, either germinated or not germinated. They might use rye, germinated or not germinated. They might use corn, germinated or not germinated. They can even, I believe, use non-malted barley to make a single grain whiskey. But same rules apply. It's all one grain, it's all one distillery. Then there's blended grain whiskey, which means it's just like blended whiskey, except that there's no germinated barley malt in that. We don't carry either of the grain products at this moment. We're going to focus on the three most popular categories, which all contain some kind of barley in them. So single malt also comes, all of the Scotch, I should say, comes from one of 5 locations. So location is also really, really popular in Scotland. And it's popular because we can make these assumptions about flavor profiles. Of course, assumptions often are proven wrong, but there's a reason we make them to kind of largely categorize these things. So Highland whiskey tends to make the kind of lightest, most elegant styles of whiskey. Highlands tend to be smoothest, easiest. There's Highland, there's Lowland, there's Speyside, there's Campbelltown, and there's Islay. So those are the 5 biggest places, or Islay sometimes in the island whiskeys, and Islay is an island. So all of those are kind of lumped sometimes into one. So they all have individual geography, and that kind of leads to people, loving either a Speyside whiskey or an Islay whiskey. For the Islay whiskey is known for peat. That smokiness that Scotch is sometimes known for is most evident, generally speaking, in Islay whiskeys. And it's big, smoky. Now, what is peat? Peat is decomposed moss, basically. Decomposed moss in these bogs. They'll dig it up, it looks like dirt, and they'll shove it in a fire, and they'll make a lot of smoke. They'll let that smoke lay down on the germinated barley malt and impregnate the malt before they even ferment it. And that way, just like in the making of, say, mezcal, where the smoke, the flavor is introduced to the base ingredient of your fermentation process before fermentation, as opposed to adding the flavor after distillation, like in the case of barrel aging in a charred barrel. So peat, that's how you do peat, and that's where it gets the smoke. But not all Scotches are peaty. Now, a lot of people say, like, oh, I don't like Scotch, it's too smoky for me. Some Scotches have no, like this Dalwhinnie has no discernible smoke on it, no discernible peat on it at all. It's literally all honeycomb and orange peel. Really delicious stuff. Whereas this Laphroaig, this is an Islay Scotch, it's not shy at all. When you're thinking about these different flavor profiles and different geographies, another way to think about them is also by the actual geography, not necessarily the place, but the place's relationship to a body of water. Just like wines are often described as being raised in either a continental climate or a coastal climate, Scotches are now thought of sometimes as an inland climate or a coastal climate. And it's not just the peat that gives those Islay whiskeys that distinct flavor, it's also the coastal region they're from gives them this brininess, this almost salinity to them. So whereas a Highland single malt might be smooth and easy and definitely the heart of inland Scotch, and Islay, clearly as the name suggests, is really on an island, and you're going to get a lot of that brininess, that iodine flavor. Something like this West Highland Oban, which Oban, I guess, stands for Little Bay of Caves. So as the name suggests, it's right on the water. This one kind of bridges the gap. Campbelltown, also another location where it has some of the characteristics of a coastal Scotch and some of the characteristics of an inland Scotch. So that's just another way of kind of sussing and pulling it apart. But the best way to do it is really just to taste them. And I recommend that wholeheartedly. Taste them. Taste them all. Scotch. How do we use Scotch? Behind the bar. Well, we don't use it behind the bar, although I really want to. How do we serve Scotch? Well, Scotch, like a lot of whiskey, is very hot right now. It's very popular, and you hear words like collectible. All of these words mean expensive. So a lot of these products take years and years to make. Often you'll see 15-year designations on their baseline. So Dalwhinnie starts, their first Scotch is a 15-year Scotch in this market. This Oban is 14 years. This Lagavulin is 16 years. Spending 16 years making something is going to make it expensive. So most of the single malts, especially the pricier ones, people are just going to have in a glass. with or without a cube, depending on their preference. And that's just how we're gonna serve it, by knowing as much as we can about it and being able to talk intelligently about it to give people a really good idea of what they can expect when they sip on it and when they enjoy it, what they can be looking for, what they can be anticipating, those kinds of things. Like knowing the difference between this smoky Islay Scotch with nice broad shoulders and deep, rich, extravagant flavors is very different than this Scotch that calls itself the Gentle Spirit, which is just all honeycomb and orange peel and just a really easy to get along with kind of thing. Very different experiences. And knowing the difference is how we serve Scotch here. That knowing really makes it, because honestly, the price points are fairly detrimental for us actually serving or using single malt Scotches in cocktails for the most part. That's why we have two other categories. We have blended malts, which are getting closer to the area, like Copper Dog is one, Monkey Shoulder is another popular in this category of blended malt, and they're getting closer into the price point where making cocktails makes sense. Another thing about using expensive spirits in general, but specifically with Scotch, is that a lot of what you're paying for on the top end of the tier in price is not some mind-leaping huge flavor. It's the nuance, it's the subtlety, it's the depth of flavor that you're paying for. That's why you're paying higher and higher. And that's kind of one of the things you lose in a cocktail, right? All of a sudden, instead of being a soloist, you're making it part of the choir. You don't get all of the nuance of the one voice. So if you're going to spend that much money on the one voice, maybe you should stick to something pretty straightforward so you can enjoy all of the different nuances of that voice. Whereas if you're going to put something in the choir, you want a strong note of what it is, and you don't want it to get lost in the choir, but it's going to lose some of its your ability to suss out the nuance. So we end up using stuff that's a little more affordable, but still very Scotchy. So Copper Dog certainly fits the bill. Johnny Walkers really do, and this is when you really are choosing your Scotch to use in a cocktail, specifically not just on price, but on flavor. So we have two Johnny Walkers here. This 12-year has demonstrably more sherry on the back end. It is smoother. It is easier. You might want to just sip on this. In fact, it's just made to be cocktailed with. By cocktailed, I don't mean used in a cocktail. I mean the 70s definition, where you pour it in there and you're cocktailing. It's just on the rocks. It's just very simple. Where if you're actually making a cocktail, this Johnny Red is a little more rustic. It's a little more angry that you think you can just sip on it. It's not really built for that. But that kind of aggressive spine really helps it come through on the other side of a cocktail and not get lost. Where some of the Scotch cocktails that we make, this will get kind of stepped on a bit, where this will really, really shine through. So even though this is the inferior product and that this is an undated, roughly 9-year product, and this is a dated, age-stamped 12-year product, this is more expensive for all the right reasons. This might actually be the right tool for the right job. So we generally use Johnny Red in most of our Scotch cocktails that are on the menu. It's kind of our go-to here. Unless you have a specific reason for reaching for something more expensive, we reach for something that's got the shoulders to not get lost in the crowd. We certainly don't want to make a Scotch cocktail and say, oh, I love this. I can barely tell there's Scotch in there. Like, why would you bother using the Scotch, right? So that's how we use Scotch. Irish whiskey. The fine folks in Ireland will be telling you they've been distilling longer than the folks in Scotland, and better. We'll leave that to you to decide. There are some differences between Irish whiskey and its more famous younger cousin, Scotch whiskey. Scotch whiskey is distilled by law 2 times, at least. Irish whiskey is distilled 3 times. So they're going for a smoother product. Most of the Irish whiskey into this country is column distilled Irish whiskey. Paddy's is one, Powers is one, Jameson, clearly, Tullamore Dew. They all make column distilled, easy, quaffable versions of Irish whiskey for their own market, but also a goodly amount for the American market, and it's working. Whereas in 2012 there were 4 distilleries in Ireland. Today I believe there's somewhere north of 30. So the idea of making whiskey in Ireland, especially for the American market, but for global market, is hot. The folks at Pernod Ricard, with Jameson as the brand, have proved that it's a viable idea, and everybody else is jumping on board. But they're not just jumping on board in the let's do shots of Jameson category. They're also going for stuff even from the same distillery, things like Redbreast and this Yellow Spot. These are what they call, as opposed to the Scotch folks that have blended whiskeys and malt whiskeys, the Irish folks, they're pretty much all have grain in them. So they don't have a single malt designation. What they have in Ireland more often is the kind of column still designation and the what they call pot still or pure pot still designation, which means it's whiskey made all in a pot still, an alembic pot still, which just is a sloppier way of distilling, which actually makes it have more of the inherent flavor of the grain, of the source material. There's a number of ways to do it, but they also, Irish whiskey is different in a way that they're allowed to add a small percent to the second pass in the still of either unfermented grain or oat oat. And they think it gives the whiskeys a nice texture. So Irish whiskeys are really coming on strong, on the one hand in the shots and mixers and quick drink category, but also on the top line when people are interested in this line of spot designated ones. There's Yellow Spot, which is 12 years. There's this Green Spot, which is an age, but it doesn't tell you what. It's a triple distilled pot still Irish whiskey. And then of course, this Blue Spot, also part of the same line, is their cask strength. And for them, cask strength means 58.7 or 117.4 proof. So across all of the categories, you're going to find people wanting straighter, higher and higher proof spirit, because we all have our own water to add. So that's their reaction to that. And as you can see, the offerings from Ireland growing from just a few kind of rail level entries and maybe Redbreast on the back bar to all these spots, a lot of different distilleries starting small, even the big guys adding stuff like Michter's or other really high-end Irish whiskeys, $100, $200 bottles of Irish whiskey. They're really trying to establish themselves as definitely a respectable niche in the whiskey family. Irish whiskey. Japanese whiskey. The backstory. Early 1900s, Japanese man decides he loves whiskey. Moves to Scotland, learns how to make whiskey, falls in love, marries a Scottish woman, brings her back to Japan, starts making whiskey. Japanese whiskey's born, everyone loves it, it's delicious, happily ever after. Well, kinda. Most of that, I believe, is true. The part that isn't is the updated. The updated thing is, unlike Scotland, which has very strict laws about the manufacture of their whiskey, or America, which has very strict laws about the manufacture of its bourbon, Japan has no such laws regulating what is or isn't Japanese whiskey. So within that margin of gray area, people can sort of take license to do what they want to do. So although most reputable manufacturers of whiskey from Japan make whiskey in Japan and market as Japanese whiskey, that became less and less ubiquitous. There were more and more companies bottling product that they either bought and blended with whiskey made in Japan, or just bottled and sent out as Japanese whiskey, that were whiskeys made all over the world, Canada, the United States, Scotland, and they were just calling it Japanese whiskey. So in response to that, while the government still has not stepped in, the industry group, the Japanese Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association, has come up with a certain agreed upon rules regarding Japanese whiskey. Now, Suntory, Nikka, all the big companies are in this association. So at least the big brands that we know are at least following these guidelines. And these guidelines say that to call yourself Japanese whiskey, the whiskey needs to be mashed, fermented, distilled, and bottled in Japan. So, Japanese. That makes sense. Now, there's a certain couple of things that you need to know. They're kind of following the stuff that doesn't meet those criteria is either called world whiskey or other like terms that let you know it's not 100% Japanese. There are a couple of really good products from some of the big companies that are blends of whiskey, and they've never been shy about this, from both Japan and Scotland and America. They're kind of coming up with these kind of outside the box ideas of a product that are it's not a slag on their quality. It's just their provenance is more complicated than either being a Scottish whiskey or an American whiskey or a Japanese whiskey. Now those will be titled world whiskeys, but from now on going forward, Japanese whiskey will be, as I said, mashed, fermented, distilled, and bottled in Japan for it to say Japanese whiskey, and it'll follow kind of along the guidelines that you expect Scotch whiskeys to be made out of, meaning defining the terms like either blended or single malt. All of those kind of terms will mean what you expect them to mean as a whiskey drinker, especially someone who's grown up drinking Scotch whiskey. The same rules apply as opposed to American bourbon. Japanese whiskeys, like Scotch whiskeys, can use caramel coloring if they want. And so they can be aged in any kind of barrel, as opposed to American whiskeys, which have to be used in first time charred oak. You don't even have to age Japanese whiskeys in oak at all. You can age them in any wood. So their definition of whiskey is a little more worldly, is a little more. Now, are we going to see a lot of like off woods? Probably not, because the reason that America made oak the standard, and it had previously kind of been the standard in Europe, is that oak is the best bang for your buck. It's a great wood to age whiskey on. It mutes sulfury flavors. It mutes some other off flavors while lending some vanilla notes and some other baking spice notes that we really have come to associate with whiskey. But also, it's a lot less expensive than other woods that some of these folks are going to want to play around with. So you're going to probably see a lot of different wood agings, but the vast majority of it is going to stay oak. So Japanese whiskey in a nutshell is going to come in things like this blended, this Toki, which is going to remind you of kind of a Dewar's. This is a blended whiskey in the same style as that your grandfather's blended Scotch. This pure malt is, as the name suggests, it's not a single malt. This is their way of saying vatted malt in Scotland, or blended malt, meaning a blend of single malts, a blend of barley whiskeys. And then, of course, this is a Nika coffee grain whiskey. Coffee is the kind of still they're using, so there's no coffee beans harmed in the making of this product. Coffee was one of the original patent stills, or like with a still with a column and maybe a thumper. So that was a really famous kind of still, and they're using that old kind of still to make a grain whiskey, meaning a whiskey that doesn't use malted barley as its base, like this. So we have grain whiskeys, just like you'd make in Scotland. We have vatted malts like you'd make in Scotland. We have blendeds that you'd make in Scotland, and of course, I don't have one here, but they make single malt whiskeys in Japan. They're kind of really modeling it on the Scotch idea, and now with reputable manufacturers that are a part of the Japan Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association, you can also kind of depend on the labeling to be a little more on the nose as well. Japanese whiskey. How do we use Japanese whiskey behind the bar? Well, we drink it. I mean, not behind the bar, but we serve it to be drunk either neat or on the rocks or with a splash of water, or in the case of the highballs that are very, very, very famous in Japan, it's blended Japanese whiskey with extremely, extremely, extremely carbonated, very, very, very cold soda. And that is the classic Japanese highball. Now, for the most part, a lot of these are coming in at price points that make cocktails prohibitively expensive. So we kind of steer toward, for most of these, we're steering toward folks for using them to sip on whiskeys, just like as you would with any like high-end spirit. But more and more, we're getting some blended whiskeys, and we're getting some other whiskeys that are kind of a little more in league, or a little more in the in cost line, where we can afford to use them in cocktails. And in that case, like something like this, it's really soft and honeyed, think about a really easygoing Scottish or Scotch, blended Scotch, like a Dewar's. One of those. This is going to be kind of that buttery, honey, soft, easy kind of whiskey profile. And anything that would work with one of those cocktails or any kind of old classic Scotch drink, Scotch cocktail at any rate, is going to work well with a Japanese whiskey. And that's generally speaking how we're using them, but it's also fun to play with ingredients like yuzu or Eastern ingredients and then pair them with an Eastern whiskey. It just works really well for all the right reasons. Japanese whiskey.